I'm on a mission like a couple spies, and that, guys, is the reason why I catechize. The good news
Welcome to the Reformed Standard. I'm Tony. Let's get started. Question 33 of the Westminster Larger Catechism reads, "Was the covenant of grace always administered after one and the same manner?" And the answer is, the covenant of grace was not always administered after the same manner, but the administrations of it under the Old Testament were different from those under the New. So this question gets at some of the distinctions and some of the nuances we were talking about in the Scots Confession, chapter 4, which sort of talked about the fact that even though there are various administrations, various covenants that fall under the heading of the covenant of grace in the Old Testament, the Scots Confession was using language of from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham to David, and so forth. But this is getting at a little bit of a different distinction. So those covenants, those administrations were slightly different from each other, but they all shared kind of a similar character and a similar quality. But the covenant of grace under the New Testament is administered in a pretty starkly different way. And the primary reasons we're going to see are going to come up in the next question, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time enumerating them here. But primarily the Old Testament administrations were administered by means of promise and shadow and type, which sort of paradoxically involved a higher degree of ceremoniality, if you want to call it that, if we can make up a word. There's more ritual, there's more pomp, there's more outward displays in the old covenant administration than there is in the new. And then in the New Testament, we are seeing, or the New Covenant, we're looking at the fulfillment of the covenant after the fact rather than anticipating it beforehand. So the technical ways to look at that would be, we're looking at it reflectively in the New Covenant administration, or we're looking at it proleptically in the Old. So the saints in the Old Testament were saved by faith in Christ, revealed by God in His Word and through the prophets alone. While we're looking at it, we're also being saved by faith in Christ, revealed by God through His Word alone. But the Old Testament saints were looking forward to a promise that had not yet fully been realized, and we're looking backwards to a promise that has already reached its fulfillment. So the covenant of grace is one, and that's important for us to know. It's important for us to remember, and that's one of the major distinctives that separates, Presbyterian and Continental Reformed confessional covenantal theology from our 1689 Baptist brethren, is that the 1689 brothers would say that the covenant of grace is one, but it doesn't include the Old Testament administrations. They would say that the Old Testament administrations are sort of shadowy promises of the new covenant, of the covenant of grace, but are not themselves administrations of the covenant of grace. And kind of on the farther side of the 1689 position, sort of, but if you were to put it on a scale between dispensationalism, which kind of denies any continuity between the covenants, and then 1689 federalism, and then maybe like Presbyterian republicanism would be on our side of the 1689 position. You have New Covenant theology, which would not deny necessarily a continuity in the promise or a continuity in the economy of salvation, but they would deny a continuity between any of the Old Testament or New Testament administrations of the covenant of grace. They would even deny the category of an overarching covenant of grace. So they're not quite dispensationalists because they deny some of the core tenets of dispensationalism, although I'm not entirely sure exactly how they justify really separating themselves. I think their position kind of logically ends there. It kind of collapses into dispensationalism when any pressure is put on it. But at the end of the day, they outwardly deny that. So they would still affirm a hard distinction between the covenant administrations in the Old Testament from each other, and then especially from the New Covenant administration in the New Testament. So those are kind of the breakdowns here. And like I said, the 1646 Westminster tradition and the traditions that follow out of it are denying that discontinuity. Now there is difference and there is some discontinuity between various administrations, and then especially the covenant of grace administered in the New Covenant. But there's probably more continuity in terms of substance than there is anything else. So that's the primary difference. And we'll get into all of the specifics that the Catechism here outlines as far as what the difference is between the administrations are. And we'll go into a little bit of detail in questions 35 and 34 in the next couple days.
Do you know, if you want, you could know this? The Catechism, hey, the Catechism, hey. Do you know what the chief and the man is? And how the Father, Son, and Spirit do manage? Do you know, if you want, you could know?
West Side.